All right, everybody, I want to say hello. I'm your president, Larry Johnson. Glad to see you all. This is an exciting day for counties all across the nation. It's about roads, it's about bridges, it's about rail and trails, broadband, water infrastructure. And you're about to hear from a dynamic staff who's broken down this bill. It's very massive, and we need someone like our NACo staff who can tell us the ins and outs of this bill. So I'm excited about it. I'm glad that we pushed for this bipartisan bill to make a difference for the people that we represent in our communities. So keep up the good work, counties. This is the first of many seminars and webinars we want to do. But I just want to say your hard work has paid off, and it's going to make a difference in the lives of not only this generation, but the next generation of people who are in our county. So take it easy. Let's make a difference continuously. This infrastructure bill is major, major, major for all of our counties. So I'll turn it over to Mark, and thank you all for your support, all the counties all over the country. I'm your president, Larry Johnson. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, President Johnson. Welcome everybody to this national membership call about the recently passed bipartisan infrastructure package in Congress, which have been months in the making and in some ways years in the making. IIJA, as you know, passed the House over the weekend after passing the Senate in August and has become law. So we have about 45 minutes of briefing for you on the IIJA, the bipartisan infrastructure deal. And then we have about 15 minutes of briefing for you on the upcoming Build Back Better legislation. So we do want to spend the majority of our time on what has become law to help counties to begin to think about implementation of this historic piece of legislation. And we have the full complement of NACo staff here ready to brief you today and also to answer your questions afterwards. I would implore you to take careful note of the slides that have people's email addresses on them so you can communicate directly with NACo staff who are combing through every word and every sentence of this massive piece of legislation to get you informed about what it means for counties. So with that, I want to turn it over to our first and foremost expert on transportation and infrastructure policy, our Associate Legislative Director for Transportation and Infrastructure, Jessica Jennings.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks to everyone for being here. Julia, if you'll skip to the next slide. So this slide just kind of basically gives you the breakdown of the new spending. Mark just gave an overview. It's $973 billion over 5 years, but we're going to focus on the new investments, which is $550 billion over 5 years. And I'm going to talk specifically about the biggest pot of that money, which is transportation at $284 billion. And we can go to the next slide. Sorry. So I've just kind of narrowed it down to some key highlights here, but I did put in the chat our comprehensive analysis of this bill. It's 2,700 pages, so there's no way we can really get into all of it here. Would ask that you check out the analysis. Let us know afterwards if you have questions or would like us to provide more detail about anything. Just to quickly highlight some big wins for counties in this bill, there is a new long-term surface transportation reauthorization. It's over 5 years, FY22 to FY26. Funding for SCBG, which is a surface transportation block grant and is by far the most valuable formula program for local governments within the surface transportation reauthorization. It increased by $20 billion from the FAST Act. So it's $72 billion over 5 years. And of that, just over $36 billion will be suballocated to local governments based on population. The off-system bridge set aside, which has been a longstanding priority of NACo's to increase. You may know that counties own almost 2/3 of off-system bridges, which are just what their name suggests. They're off the national highway system, so they do not receive the same level of investment as other bridges. This set aside increased to just over $1 billion annually. It's about $5.18 billion over the life of the bill. And that is through a set aside for the state, but they do have to spend them on off-system bridges. And this bill would also make low water crossings eligible for the set aside, which I believe is not the case in the FAST Act. New bridge investment program, $12 billion in competitive funds. There's also a formula portion that has a 15% off-system bridge set aside for the states. There's a new $2.5 billion competitive at-grade rail crossing, new $5 billion competitive program for airport terminal renovations. There's many new resources to expand transit and to increase access and service to underserved communities and rural communities. In total, in this bill, over 5 years, there's about $100 billion in competitive funds for counties and other local governments that you can access directly through the U.S. Department of Transportation. So those are just some highlights. I would also be remiss to mention before we moved on that one priority of NACo's was not accomplished, and that is returning solvency to the Highway Trust Fund. We talk a lot about that, and this bill continued the tradition of lawmakers since 2008 of transferring funds from the Treasury's General Fund to the Highway Trust Fund. In this bill, it is $118 billion. So just something to keep in mind as we continue to advocate for a permanent fix for that fund. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague Adam to talk about water and energy.
Thank you, Jessica. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Pugh, Associate Legislative Director for Ag and Rural Affairs and Environment, Energy, and Land Use. Looking at the key provisions for water in the IIJA, as it was pointed out, the new law, will invest $55 billion in water programs. It funds the clean water and drinking water SRFs combined at $29.3 billion over 5 years. The IIJA also amends the SRFs to increase the amount of money for disadvantaged communities. So as county leaders, you are familiar with these SRFs, as this is what the American Rescue Plan bases their eligible water projects on. The bill also included $15 billion to replace lead service lines. This is a critical issue, and the water industry is seeing this as a massive down payment into the critical investments needed to fix our lead service lines and our drinking water pipes. It also includes $1 billion to address other emerging contaminants and $4 billion to address PFAS in drinking water. Under the bill, it also addresses emergencies affecting public water systems, source water protection programs, assistance for small and disadvantaged communities, assistance to water systems to increase resilience and improve their sustainability efforts, rural and low-income drinking water assistance pilot programs, wastewater efficiency program, alternative water source projects, sewer overflows, stormwater reuse grants, and then workforce development in the water utility sector. Lastly, in the water section, it does reauthorize WIFIA for some of those larger projects. And then for energy and environment, the bill would invest $73 billion in energy and power, $21 billion for environmental remediation. So as part of these investments, it includes $5 billion for a new competitive grant program to enhance grid resiliency, $3.5 billion for the weatherization assistance program, $3 billion to modernize the energy infrastructure, $2.5 billion to replace or enhance transmission lines, and then $3 billion in grants for battery processing at the local level. Lastly, it does include $1.2 billion for brownfield projects. The bill does expand the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant Program, energy efficiency in public schools. It also creates a new carbon utilization grant program and a new carbon dioxide transportation infrastructure finance and innovation program, otherwise known as CIPIA, moving forward. The IIJA will address the needs of transmission lines, provide just under $630 million for county-owned or operated hydro facilities. So this is a section that I would highly recommend reviewing NACo's analysis of the bill online to learn more about the energy and environment programs under the law. Last thing I will say is it does provide a ton of money in this energy space that counties may not necessarily be directly eligible for. I highly recommend reaching out to the private energy sector that's available to really utilize and partner with them to enrich your community's lifestyle and to take advantage of these investments in this space. So next up is Seamus.
Thank you, Adam, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Seamus Dowdle. I am a legislative associate working on broadband issues. And wanted to highlight some of the major broadband provisions that came out of the IIJA that are really going to make a huge difference in providing high-speed internet access for counties across the country. And the first program is the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. This is bringing in $42.45 billion. These grants do go primarily to states, but there are a lot of opportunities for counties to play a role here. So just as an overview, the purpose of this program is to prioritize expansion of broadband deployment. The program looks primarily to rural communities, but also looks for expansion in states that are consistently ranking below the average in terms of other states with respect to broadband access and deployment. So throughout all of these programs you see on your screen, two speeds to keep in mind. They're looking at unserved communities. So these are communities that either have no broadband access or are experiencing speeds of less than 25 megabytes download and 3 megabytes upload. And then after unserved communities, they're looking at underserved communities. So these will be ones with speeds of less than 100 megabytes for download and 20 for upload. States with this program are ultimately permitted to use funds for planning and capacity building. They can also provide subgrants for broadband deployment, mapping, and adoption programs. And that's where counties come in. They are eligible to receive subgrants along with a variety of other entities from the state for implementation of these network projects. And within this program, there is a non-federal matching requirement of 25%, but ARPA funds aren't able to be used within this program. So there's a lot of different roles that counties will be able to play within this first program. Additionally, there's the Competitive Middle Mile Grant Program. This will provide $1 billion over 5 years, and local governments are considered or included as eligible entities here. And essentially what this program will provide is the ability to construct, improve, or acquire middle mile infrastructure. The program is going to prioritize utilizing existing rights-of-ways or assets or infrastructure, as well as look to projects that are facilitating interconnection facilities. And essentially, that's the majority for that program. And then below is the digital equity grant programs. This is broken down into a state digital equity program and then a competitive grant program for all other entities. So on the state side, it's going to be $1.5 billion. For all other entities, counties included, it'll be $1.25 billion. And essentially what counties are able to do in applying for those funds is if they are to receive them, they can help support digital inclusion activities, different digital equity plans within the jurisdiction, and ultimately building capacity for digital equity across the entire county. So in addition to these broadband programs, I did want to touch on a new state and local cybersecurity grant program that was authorized under this bill. It brings $1 billion of funds over 4 years. And essentially this program is intended to address cybersecurity risks and threats to any information systems that are operated by states, but also by counties. The states are going to receive these funds initially. However, within the statute, within 45 days after receiving these funds, they actually have to make not less than 80% of those funds available to local governments for using and upgrading their cybersecurity systems. And then lastly, I wanted to touch on this affordability connectivity fund. This was previously known as the Emergency Broadband Benefit. And essentially they've renamed the program, but they've extended it and they're providing an additional $14.2 billion in funds to help families and households who may be struggling to afford internet access and pay their bills, the ability to do so. The monthly benefit under the old program was originally $50. They've moved it down to $30 per month with this extension. But they've also included some other programs within this fund. One is a broadband consumer label program. So they're working to provide more transparency around provider pricing and how consumers can essentially look for the best plan for their internet service. And then the fund will also, within 2 years, allow the FCC to better combat digital discrimination. So there's a few different elements within that fund, but ultimately it will continue to provide that monthly benefit. And I think that's all for broadband. So I'll move it over to my colleague, Jonathan, to talk about public lands.
Okay, thank you, Seamus, and good afternoon, everyone. So a few of the key highlights from the bipartisan infrastructure bill that I wanted to go over are, first of all, we get a 3-year extension of that Secure Rural Schools program, otherwise known as SRS. This is the funding from the federal government to national forest counties. Not only does the bill extend the program for 3 additional years, but it also increases the funding levels to fiscal year 2017 levels, which will put around 50 million or so extra per year into county governments under this program. And it finally ends that annual 5% drawdown that we've been asking Congress to take care of for several years now. So this program will be extended through fiscal year 2023. The final round of payments will go out in the spring of 2024. In addition to reauthorizing the program, it makes a couple of really key changes that counties have been supportive of, starting with the appointments for resource advisory committees known as RACs. These are the organizations that handle the Title II money and help to prioritize how those dollars are spent on various infrastructure and landscape management projects within the national forests. And county governments have a seat at the table within these RACs. So those will now have to be approved by the Secretary of Agriculture or Interior. Those RAC appointments have to be approved or rejected within 30 days, or they will be automatically appointed as RAC members so that they can achieve those quorums and get those dollars to work on the ground for some of those important infrastructure projects. It will also allow Title III funds to be used for expanding broadband access in schools, which will be very key for rural areas for improving the education systems. There's also an additional $5.5 billion over the next 5 years for wildfire risk mitigation. This is in addition to any of the funding that have been budgeted and appropriated in the subsequent years. But this includes $3.4 billion for the Forest Service and Interior to reduce the threat of wildfire on federal lands through mechanical thinning, timber harvest, prescribed burns, community wildfire protection grants, and collaborative-led projects. In addition to that, they are mandated to come up with a plan to treat 10 million acres of forest land by 2027 for wildfire risk reduction. This is 10 million in addition to what they would normally treat, which is about 2 to 3 million a year over that time period. And this would have to be conducted within by the year 2027. And after that, the agencies will have to come up with a plan for another 10 million acre treatment over the next 5 years, and then have a longer term management plan coming down the pike. Additionally, there's $2.1 billion approved for ecosystem restoration through good neighbor agreements, which counties can enter into. Agreements for invasive species eradication, cross-boundary management projects. Those are projects that can go from federal land and onto private or state or other land, and stewardship contracts as well, which counties can work within. It also addresses roads and trails within the national forest system by adding an additional $250 million into a new Forest Service Legacy Roads and Trails program. This will allow the agencies to conduct some critical maintenance on roads and trails within the National Forest System that have been authorized. This will help with all kinds of access issues from hiking and hunting and fishing and other recreational activities to mining and timber harvest and those other heavy industries that depend on access to the National Forest. So this will be key for economic growth in a lot of these communities. And it also allows the Forest Service to decommission existing and previously closed roads and trails after they've undergone public comments, and they can show that closing those trails and roads does not impede resource, recreational, or emergency access. Moving on to Western water infrastructure, the bill has about $8.3 billion for water conveyance and storage projects, including grants for small surface and groundwater storage projects. Another $3.2 billion to upgrade aging Bureau of Reclamation infrastructure, including sites experiencing critical failures and upgrading dam safety programs. Also funding for previously authorized rural water infrastructure projects, recycling and desalination programs, additional funding for water smart grants, and support for the Colorado River Basin Drought Contingency Plan. In addition, on water issues, the bill would allow counties to use aid from the American Rescue Plan Act. That direct aid that we've all been talking about would now be, you can now use those funds to contribute to your non-federal match requirement on a Bureau of Reclamation project. So if you're trying to apply to work with the Bureau of Reclamation on a dam or some other water storage or conveyance project, you now can use those ARPA funds for the non-federal match requirements so that you can upgrade those facilities. So that's it on public lands and Western water. And I'll now turn it over to Brett.
Great, thanks, Jonathan, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brett Matson, and I handle justice and public safety policy here at NACo, and I'm going to touch on a couple of the resilience provisions within IIJA for you all. And the first of those being that the bill would create, or does create, excuse me, the Wildland Fire Mitigation and Management Commission. And so this would be a commission, a new commission that would be made up of representatives from the Bureau of Land Management, FEMA, the National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and a number of other agencies that would study and make recommendations to Congress and the administration for policies relating to the prevention, mitigation, suppression, and management of wildland fires across the United States. Obviously, this has been a very pressing issue and one that we've seen continue to pop up, particularly in our Western states. And so something that we were very excited to see. Additionally, on that commission, within the bill, it specifically identifies counties as one of 18 non-federal stakeholders that would have a seat on the commission. So certainly we're excited that counties would have a seat at the table on that commission and look forward to participating in that. Additionally, the bill fully funds the Safeguarding Tomorrow Through Ongoing Risk Mitigation or STORM Act. And so that's funded at $500 million over 5 years, which is full funding for that program. That was a new program that was created towards the end of the 116th Congress and provides state and local governments with the ability to create resilience revolving loan funds for infrastructure and water mitigation projects, or excuse me, flood mitigation projects. Additionally, the bill would provide $1 billion over 5 years for the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, or BRIC. A lot of you are probably familiar with that program. It replaced the pre-disaster mitigation program at FEMA. And currently the FY 2021 application cycle for BRIC is open. So would encourage you all, if you have not, to look into that. And then the final item that I wanted to flag for everyone within IIJA is that it would provide $3.5 billion over 5 years for the flood mitigation assistance grants. And so these are grants that can be utilized by state and local governments for projects that reduce risk and eliminate risk for repetitive flood damage to buildings for those that are insured by the National Flood Insurance Program. So those are a couple of highlights from the resilience portion. And I think I'm turning it back over to Mark now.
Thank you so much, Brett, and everyone who just gave an update. I want to leave this slide on the screen for a moment. Many of the questions we're getting in the chat are very specific to those particular briefers who just gave a rundown. And so I would encourage you to reach out to those people directly. You see their names on the screen right now. And I'm also kind of noticing many of the questions are very firmly about implementation of this historic piece of legislation. There are certain parts, specifically that question about broadband, that I'm sure Seamus will answer in the chat about consultation with local governments. And so many of these programs, we either fought for specific statutory language that required consultation, such as the broadband money that you were referring to in the Q&A button, those state grants for broadband require local consultation before projects are commenced. And then on the cybersecurity grant side, there's actually a statutory requirement that I think 80 or 85% of that money is shared with local government. So this 1,000 page bill is going to have lots of little stipulations like that. And I would really encourage you to reach out to the appropriate person on the screen here to get those questions answered directly. We're also answering questions in this webinar right now. So if you asked a question, please go to the Q&A box, and it looks like many or most of the questions have been answered. I would also encourage you to look at the chat, which has links to NACo resources that explain everything we just talked about. But there is no substitute for the expertise that all these people bring to these issues. So absolutely feel free to shoot them an email. With that, I'll turn it over to one such expert, our Deputy Director of Government Affairs, Erin Hurley.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark, and good afternoon, everyone. So now that we received that great overview of the IIJA from our government affairs colleagues, we are now going to turn our attention to the Build Back Better Act. So originally, as we all know, Congress really pushed to pass both IIJA and the Build Back Better Act in tandem, but eventually separated those two packages, of course, with IIJA passing, and then they voted to open debate on the Build Back Better Act. So the package is now linked with a price tag of 1.75 trillion, which is still unsettled among Congress. Since neither of those chambers has cleared the bill, the plan is for Congress to return to those negotiations later in November, excuse me. So before I turn over to my colleagues to provide an overview of what is included in the package with, of course, key county highlights, it definitely is worth noting that these provisions that we are highlighting are subject to change. Ultimately, if the House is able to agree and pass the package later this month, it will head to the Senate, which many of those provisions would be changed within that chamber. So with that, I would like to turn it over to my colleagues, Blair Bryant and Rachel Mackey, for their overview of the Build Back Better Act.
Thanks so much, Erin, and good afternoon to everyone. My name is Blair Bryant. I'm the Associate Legislative Director for Health here at NACo, and I'm going to stay on this slide that is currently presented and talk a little bit about how we got here and where we are today with Build Back Better negotiations. So we're going to start with some background that brought us to where we are with regards to negotiations, and we'll start all the way back in March of 2021. So in March, Congress enacts the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, which is framed by the Biden administration as a down payment for long-term economic recovery. In April, the framework for President Biden's domestic agenda was released in the form of the Americans Jobs Plan and the Americans Families Plan. Then in summer 2021, negotiations began, and that led to the bipartisan terms being agreed upon for the hard infrastructure package, which eventually passed the Senate, and as we know, just passed the House as well. Also during this time, a plan was formulated to use the budget reconciliation process to advance the other goals of the framework. In August of 2021, the fiscal year 2022 budget resolution was passed by the House and Senate with reconciliation instructions attached, signaling the start of the reconciliation process. Then in September of 2021, House Democrats introduced the first iteration of what we know today to be Build Back Better, which put a price tag at $3.5 trillion. This price tag raised objections from moderate Democrats, as well as objections on several key provisions that were included in that initial framework. Last month in October, negotiations started that would scale the package down, particularly that price tag. And the first version of the compromise legislation was released with a price tag of $1.75 trillion. And then where we are currently in November 2021, the House passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill last week, which is currently awaiting the president's signature, and negotiations continue on Build Back Better with a new deadline of end of next week emerging from House leadership. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Rachel Mackey, to dive a little deeper into the top line spending in the Build Back Better framework. Rachel?
Thanks, Blair. So before I get to that, I will just do a very quick refresher on reconciliation. As everybody knows, reconciliation is a budgetary process that allows the Senate in particular to bypass the filibuster requirement and pass legislation through a majority vote. A simple majority instead of 60 votes. So obviously there are some serious advantages to using this method in a divided, or not a divided Congress, but when you have a narrow majority, which is the case obviously in March with the American Rescue Plan Act. But there's a cost. It can be a highly partisan process because it kind of automatically assumes that the minority won't be involved in discussions. It also requires a lot of complex budgetary rules and requirements that aren't normally there for other pieces of major legislation, and especially when you're trying to accomplish as much as the Democrats are trying to accomplish in this legislation, that can make things really tricky. Provisions have to have a really significant budgetary impact, and that can really have significant implications for what stays in and what stays out. And a lot of that is up to the Senate parliamentarian. So it can be something of a risky policy process as well. But even so, it's the path forward, the only path forward for Democrats to pass these investments. So if you'll go to the next slide, even with their simple majority, there is not enough agreement amongst Democrats to have passed the initial $3.5 trillion bill that Blair was mentioning. And so they have managed to negotiate down to an agreeable top line number, and that is $1.75 trillion in new spending. However, the cost of the bill is not $1.75 trillion. In fact, the bill includes $1.5 trillion, roughly. That's an estimate, and it's not confirmed by any one source just yet. There's a couple of competing numbers, but around $1.5 trillion would be offset through revenue raising provisions. So the net deficit addition of this bill would probably be anywhere from $190 to $200 billion over the next 10 years. So that's always important to remember when we're talking about the cost of the bill. Now, those revenue raising provisions are controversial and are not necessarily agreed upon by all Democrats. But that is how much the bill would cost over 10 years. And because of this, this disagreement amongst even moderate and progressive Democrats about how much money to spend, it's very important to certain moderate Democrats that they have a full score of the bill by the Congressional Budget Office before they pass it in the House. We heard today that that score is just not available yet. It's a big bill, very complicated, a lot of interacting pieces. So at this stage, it's hard to say with any certainty how much CBO would determine that this measure would add to the deficit over 10 years. With that, Blair is going to just dig in a little bit further into what's in the bill for now. As has been noted many times, this is all subject to change as it's a very fluid process.
Thanks, Rachel. And the key words here is for now. So this is a list of provisions that we're monitoring, but it's not a comprehensive list. It's a list of some of the key provisions we've pulled out for you guys that we wanted to highlight that are in, out, or reduced. So I'll start with the first thing that is in. While the package of tax changes that would help fund the social spending package was at one point a point of disagreement in negotiations, the latest version of the compromise package includes a provision that would implement a 15% minimum tax for corporations with over $1 billion in profits, but it leaves out the other corporate tax rate increases that were included in previous versions of the bill. So back to what's out, the Clean Energy Performance Program, or CEPP, was a proposed $150 billion program that would replace coal and gas-fired power plants with wind and solar power that was the centerpiece of President Biden's climate agenda. However, this program was swapped out in the latest version for other less expensive climate provisions. So in terms of what else is in, universal pre-K, a 3-year ACA subsidy extension, Medicare hearing benefits that replace the originally proposed Medicare dental and vision expansion, and what will be 2 major wins for counties once the package is passed. And the first is the increase in the cap on state and local tax deductions. And then the second is a provision that would allow individuals in jail to access Medicaid benefits 30 days prior to their release, known as the Medicaid Reentry Act. Other items that were cut include free community college, and as I mentioned, the Medicare dental and vision expansion. And then there were a number of items that, while they weren't cut, they were significantly reduced in an effort to reach that compromise price tag of $1.75 trillion. So this includes scaling back the length of expanded refundable tax credits from 4 years to 1, cutting child nutrition funding from $35 billion to $9 billion, cutting housing assistance in half from $300 billion to $150 billion, a pared back provision on negotiations for drug pricing under Medicare, and reducing paid family leave from 12 weeks to 4 weeks. So as has been mentioned before at the top of this update, this is just the latest version of a framework that is likely to change again. So for more on the legislative outlook for the package and what it means for counties, I'll turn it back to Rachel.
Yeah, so as Blair said, where the bill is right now in the House is a piece of draft legislation. They have not voted on it. They've agreed to debate, but they haven't voted. And some of that is because there are ongoing disagreements, both within the House, but also between the House and Senate, on what should be in the final bill. So right now, with no CBO score, there is no vote on the calendar. That said, we could see in the near future the House vote on the bill and just send it to the Senate without an agreement between chambers, and then it would be up to the Senate to refine it, make sure it's compliant with budget reconciliation provisions, make any changes, and then send it back to the House for final passage. None of this is easy, though. In order for this to go through, all the Democrats in the Senate, including Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, who are both more moderate and have been holdouts on many of these proposals, have to vote in support of the bill. And even in the House, the majority is very narrow, and they cannot lose more than 3 Democratic votes in order to get this legislation passed. It's quite a tightrope to walk, and key provisions are still under debate. While right now, for instance, the SALT cap, which would be a big win for counties, is lifted in the bill, that is an issue that remains to be seen whether it can make it through the Senate. Similarly, some of the tax provisions that would raise revenue remain unpopular and could see changes. Paid leave is also a provision that, while it made it back into the House draft, has seen opposition from Senator Manchin. So those are just a few, but it's a very large bill, and there could be lots of tweaks on the margins too. This also means, of course, that the Senate parliamentarian is going to have her opportunity to rule on what's compliant and what's not. So we could see changes beyond that. Right now, there are some immigration provisions in the bill that would expedite green cards on a temporary basis and provide some temporary relief for certain undocumented immigrants in the country. But it's hard to say whether those would end up passing through the Senate parliamentarian or not. So
the moral of the story is that we're not quite sure where things are headed, but we know that this is a key priority for Democratic leadership and the White House, and they are determined to get this package done, whether it's this month or next month, or even into the new year, although I think they would really hope that it would be otherwise. So if you'll go to the final slide here, ultimately what it means for counties. The provisions in Build Back Better are historic, and they would significantly impact county systems and the lives of county residents. In the bill, there are certain policy wins, but there's also a lot of implementation challenges and responsibilities that we could see be mandated or passed down onto county governments. Obviously, also, reconciliation is a very partisan process, and NACo always encourages bipartisan solutions to our nation's pressing challenges. But regardless of that, we know we need to have a seat at the table and a strong role in implementation if this package does become law. So we will be working with our federal partners to ensure, both in Congress and in the administration, that if and when this bill is passed, that we have adequate administrative resources and technical assistance to see it through, that states are required to consult with the counties on major plans and major new provisions, and that we're protected from unfunded mandates as we carry out many of the services and deliver on many of the investments that are made in the bill. So with that, I think I will be turning it back to Aaron and Mark to close us out.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Since we have a couple extra minutes here, wanted to leave this slide again on the screen for you all to reach out to these really just talented group of folks. I'm a bit biased, but I don't think you're going to get a better rundown of IIJA or Build Back Better from anywhere. So really, I enjoyed that presentation, and I hope you all did too. And these are direct contact to the folks who just briefed us. I did want to mention something else that NACo is working very hard on as Congress figures out what to do with the Build Back Better Act. We are very much pushing for another piece of legislation. It's HR 5735 in the House. You'll hear it referred to by many names because the actual bill title is a bit of a mouthful, but we refer to it as the Cornyn-Padilla ARP flexibility legislation. It's a bill that and the reason I'm doing this is because I saw several questions about ARP and how you can use ARP funds. It's a bill that would provide enormous flexibility with regard to already allocated ARP funds. Some of those funds could be used for infrastructure. Some of those funds could be used for the provision of government services, such as hiring first responders, purchasing ambulances, building county-owned buildings, and just, again, an enormous range of possible uses of this money, really going back to what Congress originally intended with the ARP, which is to be as flexible and as broad as possible. So what we are asking you all to do, and for those of you who join us on every call, you've heard us say it before, but what we're asking you to do is to really reach out to your House members and ask them to co-sponsor this bill. That is the quickest way that we can get this bill passed. It's HR 5735. It already has 75 co-sponsors in the House, and there's many more waiting. There's a particular focus on Democratic House members to line up as co-sponsors. So to the extent that we as the county focused group here can get Democratic co-sponsors to co-sponsor this legislation, it would be an enormous step forward in providing the flexibility for ARP funds so that not only will you be in receipt of the funds from IIJA, potentially in receipt of future funds from Build Back Better, but you can use your already allocated ARP funds for a much broader range of uses than Treasury currently allows. Passing this bill is one of our highest priorities this fall, other than what you've already heard about implementation of IIJA and the passage of Build Back Better. So again, urge your House members to co-sponsor the Cornyn-Padilla legislation. Again, it's HR 5735. It has a really long title, so just go by the bill number. And we greatly appreciate it because that would really create an enormous flexibility for all counties. It will restore local control for a lot of these funds, and it would go a long way in elevating counties in the intergovernmental partnership. So we really appreciate your help in doing that. And with that, I'll just turn it back over to Aaron Hurley to bring us home.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. And again, just to reiterate Mark's comments around HR 5735, this is a huge priority for NACo right now. We also did come out with a recent analysis of the bill too, with county estimations that if the bill was enacted, how much of the funds of your county's ARP allocation would actually free up. So with that, we thank everyone for joining today's call. We also are coming out with an analysis of the Build Back Better Act as well too, which you will be able to access that on NACo's website in the coming days as well. But again, thank you so much to our government affairs team for their presentations and to our participants for joining us today. Take care, everyone.